The August sun beat down mercilessly on Cincinnati, Ohio, reflecting off the Ohio River that cut through the city with its dark, sluggish waters. It was 1989, and Pete Rose walked along Vine Street with heavy steps, his Reds cap pulled low, trying to hide the face that everyone knew. At 48 years old, this man who had been adored by millions now avoided glances on the streets of the very city where he'd become a legend. Pete Rose! A group of teenagers recognized him on the corner of 4th Street. Pete waved mechanically, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. These were different shouts from what he used to hear. There was no longer that reverence, that gleam of pure admiration. Now it was morbid curiosity, the fascination of seeing up close someone who had fallen from their pedestal. Pete entered Findlay Market, the public market that had been operating since 1852, seeking refuge among the stalls of fresh produce and the smell of baked bread. The place was packed for a Saturday morning, families shopping, tourists taking photos, vendors announcing their wares. Normally, he avoided places like this, but today he needed to get out of the house. The walls of the apartment were suffocating him. "Look who's here." The voice came from behind a tomato stand. It was Danny Mitchell, an old schoolmate from back in the day, the greatest hitter of all time. Or should I say the greatest gambler? Pete felt his blood rise, but kept walking. He had learned to swallow the anger, the shame, the humiliation. These were lessons that cost dearly for a man who had spent his entire life being celebrated. 3 months earlier, on August 24th, Pete Rose had been permanently banned from baseball. Commissioner Bart Giamatti's investigation had proven that he bet on games, including games of his own team while he was managing the Cincinnati Reds. The sentence was irrevocable, lifetime ban. No chance of entering the Hall of Fame, no chance of official redemption for a man who had dedicated every second of his life to baseball since he was 6 years old. It was more than punishment. It was an execution. Pete bought a coffee at one of the market cafes and sat on a worn wooden bench. The spot offered a partial view of where the Great American Ballpark would be built years later. For now, the old Riverfront Stadium still stood there, where Pete had played so many memorable games. He thought about Carol, his second wife. The marriage was hanging by a thread. The fights were constant. Money was scarce. Gambling debts chased him like hungry shadows. Carol was right when she screamed that he had destroyed everything, his career, his reputation, the family's financial security. But Pete couldn't admit it out loud. Admitting would mean accepting that he had wasted everything. "Excuse me, sir." A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. Pete looked up. It was a black man about 60 years old. Neatly trimmed grey hair, wearing suspenders over a faded blue shirt. There was genuine kindness in his brown eyes. "Do you mind if I sit? My knees aren't what they used to be." Pete gestured to the empty space beside him. The man sat down with a sigh of relief, placing a shopping bag at his feet. Lettuce, carrots, a wrapped chicken. "Hot day, isn't it?" the man said, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his forehead. "Yeah." Pete kept his answers short. He wasn't in the mood for conversation. "I've been coming here every week for 30 years, the man continued, looking around the market. "Ever since I moved to Cincinnati. Worked at the Procter & Gamble factories for 28 years. Retired last month." Pete nodded, taking a sip of the lukewarm coffee. "You know, I recognized you." The man said this without looking directly at Pete, keeping his eyes on the people passing by. "Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle. I saw you play many times. My son and I used to go to the games. He loved baseball." Pete felt his muscles tense. Here it came. The judgment, the recriminations, the disappointment. "Used to?" Pete asked against his will. The man was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower. "He died in Vietnam, 1971. He was 19 years old." Pete turned to look at the man for the first time, really look. He saw the old pain in his eyes, that kind of sadness that never completely goes away, just settles into deeper layers. "I'm sorry," Pete said, and he meant it. Marcus was his name. Marcus Washington. The man smiled sadly. He wanted to be a baseball player. Wasn't bad, you know. Played in school. Had a strong arm. But life had other plans. The wind blew between the market stalls, carrying the smell of spices and ripe fruit. Children ran between the adults, their laughter echoing under the metal roof. "After Marcus died," Washington continued, "I went into a dark hole, very dark. Lost my job, almost lost my wife, Dorothy. Started drinking, a lot. I'd wake up thinking about drinking, go to sleep drunk. It was all I could do to bear the pain." Pete looked at the coffee in his hands. He knew that kind of pain, different from losing a child, but equally devastating. The pain of losing who you were. One day I was at my lowest point, had lost everything. I was sitting on a bench, similar to this one, thinking it wasn't worth going on, and a complete stranger sat down next to me, a white man, well-dressed. He didn't know me from anyone. Washington paused, his eyes shining with the memory. He just started talking about the weather, about the city, about nothing important. And then he told me something that changed my life. What did he say? Pete asked, genuinely curious now. He said, "Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. And no matter how far you've fallen, there's always a ladder to climb. But you have to want to grab it." Washington looked directly at Pete now. He didn't know anything about me, didn't know about my son, about the drinking, about anything. But somehow, those words reached me when I needed them most. Pete felt something stir inside his chest. It was uncomfortable, like an old wound being touched. "I went home that day," Washington continued, "and I told Dorothy I needed help, real help. We found a support group. I started going to AA meetings. It took years, Mr. Rose, years of falling and getting back up, but I did it. And you know what I learned?" Pete shook his head slowly. "I learned that falling doesn't define you. Everyone falls. What defines you is whether you stay down or find the courage to get back up." Washington stood slowly, picking up his shopping bag. "I know you're going through something difficult. I don't know the details, and it's not my business. But I wanted to tell you this. That stranger helped me when I needed it most. So maybe I can help you today, even if it's just by reminding you that you're not alone in your pain." Before Pete could respond, Washington extended his hand. Pete took it, feeling the firm grip of someone who had worked with his hands his entire life. "My name is James Washington, by the way, not just Washington." The man smiled warmly. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm usually here on Saturdays. Same time, same bench, buying groceries for Sunday dinner." With that, James Washington walked away, disappearing into the crowd of the market. Pete sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space beside him, feeling the weight of those words settling into his mind. The afternoon was advancing when Pete finally left Findlay Market. The heat hadn't diminished, but something inside him felt slightly different. He couldn't define what it was, maybe a tiny crack in the wall of bitterness he'd built around himself. He walked toward the parking lot where he'd left his car, a black Chevrolet Corvette from 1978, one of the few luxuries he'd managed to keep. As he unlocked the door, he noticed a flyer tucked under the windshield wiper. It wasn't an advertisement or a parking ticket. It was a handwritten note on a piece of yellow paper. "Mr. Rose, you don't know me, but I wanted to say thank you. My father took me to see you play in 1975 during the World Series against the Red Sox. It was the best day of my life. He died last year, and that memory is one of the things I treasure most. Whatever mistakes you've made, you also gave joy to millions of people. That has to count for something. A grateful fan." Pete read the note 3 times. His hands were shaking. He carefully folded the paper and put it in his wallet, next to a photo of his children. Driving home through the streets of Cincinnati, Pete looked at the city with different eyes. This was the place where he'd been born, where he'd learned to play baseball in the dusty fields of the West Side, where his father, Harry Rose, had taught him that the only way to do anything was to give it your all. Charlie Hustle. That's what his teammates called him, because Pete never did anything halfway. He ran to first base even on walks. He dove headfirst into bases. He played with an intensity that was almost maniacal. And now, who was he now without baseball? He arrived at the apartment building in Montgomery, a quiet suburb north of Cincinnati. It was a modest place, nothing compared to the mansion he'd owned during his glory days. Carol's car wasn't in the parking lot. She was probably at her mother's house, where she'd been spending more and more time. Inside the apartment, Pete threw his keys on the kitchen counter and opened the refrigerator. There wasn't much. Some beer, leftover Chinese food, condiments. He grabbed a Budweiser and sat on the couch in the living room. The phone rang. Pete looked at it, debating whether to answer. On the 5th ring, he picked up. "Pete Rose." His voice sounded tired. "Pete, it's Reuven Katz." His lawyer's voice was tense. "We need to talk. The IRS is escalating the investigation. They're saying you owe back taxes on unreported gambling winnings. We're looking at serious numbers here." Pete closed his eyes. Of course, it wasn't enough to have lost baseball. Now the government wanted its pound of flesh. "How much are we talking about?" Pete asked, although he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Conservative estimate? $350,000, maybe more." Katz paused. Pete, you need to take this seriously. They can press criminal charges. We're talking possible jail time. The words hit Pete like a punch to the stomach. Jail. Prison. The ultimate humiliation for someone who had been a hero. What do I need to do? Pete asked quietly. We need to meet. Tomorrow. Bring all your financial records, bank statements, gambling records, everything. We need to build a defense strategy. Katz's voice softened slightly. Pete, I know things are tough right now, but you need to face this head on. Running won't help. After hanging up, Pete sat in silence. The apartment felt oppressively quiet. He thought about James Washington's words. Falling doesn't define you. What defines you is whether you stay down or find the courage to get back up. But how do you get back up when the whole world is pushing you down? The Cincinnati skyline looked different at dawn. Pete Rose stood by the window of his apartment, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the sun slowly illuminate the city. He hadn't slept. The meeting with Reuven Katz was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and the weight of what awaited him made rest impossible. At 48, Pete felt older than his years. The lines on his face had deepened, carved by stress and regret. His dark hair, once thick and full, was thinning at the crown. But his hands, those were still the hands of a ball player, strong, with thick fingers that had gripped a bat thousands upon thousands of times. He showered and dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue suit that Carol had bought him 2 years ago for a charity event. It was important to look professional, respectable, even if he didn't feel either of those things. The drive downtown took 30 minutes through light traffic. Cincinnati in September was beautiful, the trees beginning their slow transformation into autumn colors, the air carrying a crispness that promised cooler days ahead. Pete passed by Crosley Field's former location, now just an empty lot with a small memorial plaque. That's where he'd played his first major league game in 1963, a nervous 22-year-old rookie who had no idea he would go on to break records that seemed untouchable. Katz's office was in the Carew Tower, Cincinnati's tallest building, an Art Deco masterpiece that had dominated the skyline since 1930. Pete took the elevator to the 23rd floor, each floor number lighting up, feeling like a countdown to judgment. The receptionist, a young woman with bright red lipstick and professional smile, recognized him immediately. Mr. Rose, Mr. Katz is expecting you. Conference room B, down the hall to your left. Reuven Katz was already in the conference room, surrounded by stacks of documents, file folders, and yellow legal pads covered in notes. He was a small man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually worried expression, but he was good at his job, one of the best tax attorneys in Ohio. Pete, come in, sit down. Katz gestured to a chair across from him. Coffee? Something stronger? I'm fine. Pete sat, feeling like a defendant at his own trial. Katz wasted no time. I've been going through everything. The situation is complicated, but not impossible. The IRS has documentation of gambling winnings that you didn't report. We're talking about income from 1984 through 1987. They have records from various bookmakers, including some who are cooperating with federal investigators. Pete felt his jaw tighten. Those sons of bitches. Pete, this isn't about loyalty or betrayal. This is about the law. Katz pulled out a spreadsheet. According to their calculations, you won approximately $1.2 million in those years. After losses, your net winning was around $400,000. You reported none of it. I didn't think. That's the problem. Katz interrupted, not unkindly. You didn't think. Gambling winnings are taxable income, period. The fact that you also had losses doesn't matter if you can't document them properly. And based on what I'm seeing, your record keeping was, to put it mildly, inadequate. Pete stared at the spreadsheet, the numbers swimming before his eyes. How had it come to this? He thought back to when the gambling had started. Small bets at first, just for fun. A way to make watching other games more exciting. Then it grew. Bigger bets, more frequent. Until it consumed him. What are my options? Pete asked. 3 scenarios. Katz held up 3 fingers. 1. We fight this completely. Claim the IRS calculations are wrong. Demand they prove every penny. This will be expensive, time-consuming, and frankly, we'll probably lose. 2. We negotiate a settlement, admit to some of the liability, work out a payment plan, try to avoid criminal charges. 3. We fully cooperate. You come clean about everything, pay what you owe plus penalties and interest, and hope for leniency. How much are we talking in scenario 3? Katz consulted his notes. With penalties and interest, probably close to $500,000. Pete felt the room spin. I don't have $500,000. I know. Which is why scenario 2 is probably our best bet. Katz leaned forward. Pete, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anything else? Anything else that could come out that I need to know about? Pete thought about the offshore accounts, the cash payments, the side deals he'd made over the years. His silence was answer enough. Jesus, Pete, Katz muttered, rubbing his eyes under his glasses. Okay, we need to do a full financial disclosure. Everything, every account, every asset, every source of income. If we're going to negotiate with the IRS, we need to know exactly where we stand. They spent the next 3 hours going through Pete's finances. It was a depressing exercise. The houses he'd owned, sold at losses, the bad investments in businesses that had failed, the money loaned to friends who never paid him back, the gambling debts still outstanding. When they finished, the picture was clear. Pete Rose was essentially broke. The only significant asset you have is your autograph value, Katz said. You could do signing sessions, memorabilia deals. That's sustainable income. Trading on my name, Pete said bitterly. Selling my signature to people who want a piece of Charlie Hustle. It's honest work, Pete. And right now, you need every dollar you can get. Katz closed his files. I'll start negotiations with the IRS. In the meantime, keep your nose clean. No more gambling. No more anything that could make this worse. Pete left the Carew Tower feeling hollowed out. The autumn sun seemed too bright, the street noise too loud. He walked aimlessly for a while, not ready to go back to the empty apartment. He found himself at Fountain Square, the heart of downtown Cincinnati. The Tyler Davidson Fountain, erected in 1871, depicted a woman with arms outstretched, water cascading around her. It was a meeting place, a landmark, a symbol of the city. Pete sat on one of the benches surrounding the fountain, watching people go about their lives. A father and son walked past, the boy wearing a Reds jersey with Larkin on the back. Barry Larkin, the current shortstop. The kid was maybe 7 or 8, animated and happy, pointing at the fountain and laughing. The father smiled indulgently, his hand on the boy's shoulder. Pete remembered taking his own son, Pete Jr., to games when he was that age. The wonder in the boy's eyes as he watched his father play, the pride. Now Pete Jr. was 20 years old, and their relationship was strained. The divorce from his first wife, the gambling scandal, the public disgrace, it had all taken its toll. Mr. Rose? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Pete looked up to see a man in his 60s wearing a Korean War veteran cap and carrying a cane. I thought that was you. Name's Frank Delgado. I just wanted to shake your hand. Pete stood automatically, accepting the handshake. Nice to meet you, Frank. I saw you play in '75, the World Series, Game 6 in Boston. Frank's eyes lit up with the memory. That was the greatest game of baseball I've ever witnessed. You were magnificent. Thank you, Pete said, genuinely touched. That means a lot. I know you're going through a rough patch, Frank continued, but I want you to know, what you did on that field, nobody can take that away. 4,256 hits. That's eternal, Mr. Rose. That's eternal. After Frank walked away, Pete sat back down, his throat tight. The irony wasn't lost on him. The record that should have guaranteed him immortality in the Hall of Fame was now just a statistic, meaningless in the face of his banishment. His mind drifted back to that game Frank had mentioned. October 21st, 1975. Game 6 of the World Series at Fenway Park. The Red Sox versus the Reds. It was one of the greatest games in baseball history, a back-and-forth battle that went into extra innings, ending with Carlton Fisk's legendary home run in the 12th inning. Pete had gone 2 for 5 that night. He remembered every at-bat, every pitch. The electricity in the stadium, the roar of the Boston crowd, the feel of the bat connecting with the ball. The Reds had lost that game, but won the series in Game 7. Those were the glory days, when life was simple, when he was a hero. Pete's reverie was broken by the sound of his pager beeping. He checked it. Carol. He found a payphone near the fountain and called home. Where are you? Carol's voice was sharp. Downtown. Had a meeting with Katz. And, it's bad, Carol. Really bad. There was a long silence on the other end. When Carol spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less strained. I can't do this anymore, Pete. I can't keep living like this, waiting for the next disaster. I know. Pete closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the cool metal of the payphone. I know I've messed everything up. It's not just the money. It's everything. The lies, the gambling, the refusing to admit you have a problem. Carol's voice cracked. I've tried, Pete. God knows I've tried, but I'm drowning here. What are you saying? I'm saying I need time to think, real time. I'm going to stay with my mother for a while, maybe a few weeks, maybe longer. Carol, please, don't. Don't make promises you can't keep. You've done that too many times. She paused. I do love you, Pete. Or at least, I love who you used to be. But I don't know if that person exists anymore. The line went dead. Pete stood there holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone, feeling like the last thread connecting him to his old life had just snapped. He walked back to his car in a daze. The afternoon had turned grey, clouds rolling in from the west, promising rain. As he drove back toward Montgomery, the first drops began to fall, splattering against the windshield. On impulse, Pete turned the car around and headed toward Riverside Drive. He parked near Riverfront Stadium and sat in the car, staring at the concrete structure that had been his second home for so many years. He thought about all the games played within those walls. The 1970 All-Star Game, where he'd collided with catcher Ray Fosse, knocking him unconscious in a play that became legendary for its intensity. The pennant races, the World Series championships in 1975 and 1976. The night in 1978 when he got his 3,000th hit. The crowd chanting, Pete, Pete, Pete. And then 1985, September 11th, his 4,192nd hit, breaking Ty Cobb's record. The game stopped. A red Corvette was driven onto the field. Confetti fell from the sky. The crowd gave him a 7-minute standing ovation. His son, Pete Jr., brought out the ball and the first base bag. It was the pinnacle of his career, the moment that should have cemented his place in baseball immortality. 4 years later, here he sat, banned from the game, facing financial ruin and possible prison time. The rain came harder now, drumming on the car roof. Pete didn't move. He sat there as afternoon faded into evening, watching the stadium lights come on through the downpour, remembering ghosts of glory that now seemed like someone else's life. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn weather that made Cincinnati feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Pete Rose woke early, his back aching from sleeping on the couch. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in the bed he'd shared with Carol. The apartment felt cavernous in its emptiness. He made coffee and stared at the calendar on the refrigerator. Carol had marked various appointments in her neat handwriting. Dentist visits, dinner plans with friends, reminders to pay bills, all the mundane details of a normal life. A life that now seemed impossibly distant. Pete remembered what James Washington had said about coming to Findlay Market every Saturday. It was barely 8 o'clock, too early for grocery shopping. But Pete found himself showering, dressing in jeans and a polo shirt, and driving downtown anyway. The city was quiet at this hour. The streets that would later be packed with shoppers and tourists were nearly empty. Pete parked near the market and walked, hands in his pockets, no particular destination in mind. He passed the old Paramount Theater, now called the Cincy, its Art Deco facade gleaming in the morning sun. He remembered taking his first wife, Carolyn, to see movies there when they were young and in love, when the future seemed limitless and bright. Without planning to, Pete found himself at the Western and Southern Life Insurance building where the Cincinnati Reds offices were located. He stood across the street, looking up at the windows. Somewhere in there, people were making decisions about the team's future. A future that didn't include him. Waiting for it to tell you something? A familiar voice came from behind him. Pete turned to see James Washington, carrying a newspaper under his arm and a coffee cup in his hand. Mr. Washington, Pete said, surprised. James, just James. The older man smiled. I stop at the coffee shop before I do my grocery shopping. Dorothy says I need to cut back on caffeine, but some habits are hard to break. He gestured to the Reds building. A lot of memories in there for you, I imagine. Yeah. Pete looked back at the building. A lifetime of them. You want to walk a bit? James asked. I've got time before the market gets too crowded. They walked together toward the riverfront, the Ohio River brown and wide beside them. A few joggers passed, and in the distance, a barge moved slowly upstream, pushing against the current. I've been thinking about what you said last week, Pete said finally, about falling and getting back up. And I'm not sure I know how. Everything I was, everything I worked for my entire life, it's gone. Baseball was all I knew. Without it, I don't know who I am. James nodded slowly. Can I tell you about my Marcus? Sure. He was a good kid, smart, funny, full of dreams. When he got drafted, he was scared. We all were, but he went because he felt it was his duty. He wrote us letters every week from Vietnam, told us about the other soldiers, about the heat, about missing home. James's voice grew quieter. The last letter we got, he talked about wanting to come home and coach Little League Baseball. Said he wanted to teach kids the right way to play the game. They sat on a bench overlooking the river. A flock of geese flew overhead in V formation, heading south. The army sent an officer to our house, James continued, August 3rd, 1971, a Tuesday. Dorothy was making dinner, meatloaf, Marcus's favorite. There was a knock on the door, and I knew. Before the officer said a word, I knew. Pete didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. After that, I was angry at everyone, at the government, at the military, at God. But mostly, I was angry at myself. I thought, maybe if I'd tried harder to keep him home, maybe if I'd encouraged him to go to Canada, maybe. James looked at Pete. That anger nearly destroyed me. The drinking was just a symptom. The real problem was that I couldn't forgive myself for something that wasn't actually my fault. How did you move past it? I didn't move past it, James said. You don't move past losing a child, but I learned to live with it. That stranger I told you about, the one who talked to me on the bench, he said something else I didn't mention. He said that guilt is like carrying a stone. You can hold on to it your whole life, but it won't bring back what you've lost. All it does is weigh you down so much that you can't move forward. Pete thought about his own stones, the lies about gambling, the betrayal of the game he loved, the hurt he'd caused his family. He'd been carrying them so long they felt like part of him. I've done things I'm not proud of, Pete said quietly. Things I can't take back. None of us can take back the past, Pete. We can only choose what we do with today. James finished his coffee and crushed the cup. You know what helped me the most? Helping others. I started volunteering at the VA hospital, talking to veterans who were struggling. I joined a program that mentored kids who'd lost parents in the military. I couldn't save Marcus, but I could honor his memory by making sure other kids didn't fall through the cracks. I don't know how I could help anyone, Pete said. I'm not exactly a role model right now. Maybe not. But you have something valuable, experience. You know what it's like to be at the top of the world. And now you know what it's like to fall. That's not something you can learn from a book. They sat in silence for a while, watching the river flow past. A riverboat, one of the tourist boats that offered lunch cruises, was docking at the landing, its calliope playing a cheerful tune that seemed incongruous with Pete's mood. Can I ask you something? Pete said. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me. For all you know, I'm exactly the terrible person the media says I am. James smiled. That stranger who helped me, I never even got his name. He just appeared when I needed him and then disappeared. I've spent 18 years wondering why he did it, what made him stop and talk to a desperate black man he'd never met. He stood, stretching his back. I finally figured it out. He did it because that's what we're supposed to do for each other. We're all walking around with invisible wounds, carrying invisible stones. When you see someone drowning, you don't ask them why they jumped in the water. You throw them a rope. James extended his hand. I need to go do my shopping before Dorothy wonders what happened to me. But same time next Saturday, if you want to talk, I'll be here. Pete shook his hand. Thank you, James. I mean that. After James left, Pete stayed on the bench. The morning was advancing, the sun climbing higher, warming the air. He thought about what James had said about guilt being like carrying a stone. The truth was, Pete had been lying to himself for years. Not just about the gambling, that was obvious now, but about everything. He'd told himself he was in control, that he could stop any time he wanted, that it wasn't affecting his judgment or his relationships. He'd convinced himself that the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to him, because he was Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, the hit king. But who was he really? Strip away the baseball records, the fame, the public persona. Who was the real Pete Rose? He was a kid from the West Side who'd been taught by his father that anything worth doing was worth doing with everything you had. He was a player who'd made himself great through sheer determination and relentless effort. He wasn't the most talented player. There were guys with better hands, faster legs, stronger arms. But nobody worked harder than Pete Rose. And then, somewhere along the way, he'd lost that. He'd started taking shortcuts, started believing he was smarter than everyone else, started thinking he was above the rules. Pete pulled out his wallet and found the note that had been left on his car windshield the week before. The one from the grateful fan whose father had taken him to the 1975 World Series. He read it again. Whatever mistakes you've made, you also gave joy to millions of people. That has to count for something. Did it count? Could it count? Pete stood and walked back toward his car. On the way, he passed a newsstand and grabbed a copy of the Cincinnati Enquirer. On the sports page, there was an article about the Reds' upcoming season, speculation about trades and prospects. Pete Rose wasn't mentioned. It was as if he'd never existed. He drove to Mount Airy Forest, a large park on the northwest side of Cincinnati. His father used to take him there as a kid. They'd hike the trails, and Harry Rose would talk about life, about sports, about what it meant to be a man. "You give your word, you keep it," his father had said. "You make a mistake, you own it. You fall down, you get back up. That's what men do, Pete. They don't make excuses. They don't blame others. They stand up and face the consequences of their choices." Pete found a quiet spot under an old oak tree and sat on the ground, his back against the rough bark. He thought about all the choices he'd made that led him to this moment. Each one had seemed small at the time. One bet, one lie, one compromise. But they'd accumulated like compound interest until the debt was so large it seemed impossible to repay. He thought about his conversation with Reuven Katz, about the IRS investigation and the very real possibility of prison time. He thought about Carol staying with her mother, trying to decide if their marriage was worth saving. He thought about his children, Pete Jr. and Fawn from his first marriage, Tyler from his second, and how his actions had affected them. For the first time in months, maybe years, Pete allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd done. Not the public shame, not the career consequences, but the real damage to real people who trusted him and loved him. He sat under that oak tree and cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place inside him that had been locked away for too long. He cried for his marriage, for his relationship with his children, for the game he'd loved and betrayed. He cried for the man he'd been and the man he'd become. When the tears finally stopped, the sun had moved across the sky. Pete felt hollow but also somehow lighter, as if those tears had washed away some of the accumulated grime of years of denial. He drove home as dusk was falling. The apartment was still empty. Carol hadn't come back. But Pete didn't turn on the television or reach for a beer. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen. At the top of the page, he wrote, "People I've hurt and how I can make amends." The list grew long. Carol, his children, his teammates, the fans who'd believed in him, the game of baseball itself. Some of these wounds couldn't be healed. Some damage was permanent. But maybe, just maybe, he could start trying to make things right. Not for absolution. He didn't deserve that. But because it was the right thing to do. He started with Carol. He wrote her a letter, not making excuses, not begging her to come back, just apologizing. Genuinely, specifically apologizing for each of the ways he'd failed her, for the lies about gambling, for the financial insecurity he'd created, for prioritizing his own desires over her needs and their marriage, for not being the partner she deserved. When he finished the letter, it was 3 pages long, front and back. His hand cramped from writing, but it felt good, honest. He sealed it in an envelope and addressed it to Carol at her mother's house. Then he started another letter, this one to Pete Jr. It was harder to write. How do you apologize to your son for failing to be the father he needed, for being so consumed with your own career and demons that you missed important moments in his life, for teaching him, through your actions, that rules don't matter if you're famous enough? Pete worked late into the night, writing letters to Fawn, to Tyler, to his first wife, Carolyn. Some he would send, some he wouldn't. But writing them forced him to confront exactly what he'd done and why it was wrong. Around midnight, exhausted, Pete finally went to bed. For the first time in weeks, he slept deeply, dreamlessly. The following week passed in a strange blur of activity and introspection. Pete met with Reuven Katz twice more, going through financial documents and preparing for negotiations with the IRS. He met with a bankruptcy attorney to understand his options. He contacted a sports memorabilia company about doing autograph signings. The work was humbling. Pete Rose, who had once commanded 6-figure salaries and lucrative endorsement deals, was now haggling over how much he could charge per autograph. The memorabilia company offered him $50 per signature, with sessions of 4 hours at card shows and sports conventions. It was honest work, as Katz had said, but it felt like the final confirmation of how far he'd fallen. On Wednesday, Pete received a call from Tommy Helms, his old teammate from the Reds' glory years. Tommy had heard about Pete's troubles and wanted to check in. "Man, I'm sorry about everything that's gone down," Tommy said over the phone. His Kentucky accent was thick and warm. "I know it's been rough." "That's putting it mildly," Pete said. "Look, I don't know if this helps, but remember that rain delay in Pittsburgh? Must have been 74 or 75? Pete searched his memory. They'd had so many rain delays over the years. "We were stuck in the clubhouse for 3 hours," Tommy continued. And you spent the whole time teaching that rookie, what was his name, how to read a pitcher's tell. You didn't have to do that. The kid was nervous, thought he was going to get sent down, but you sat with him, walked him through it, made him feel like he belonged. I don't really remember that, Pete admitted. That's my point. You did stuff like that all the time. You were a leader, Pete. You made everyone around you better. That's what I remember when I think about Pete Rose. Not the other stuff. That guy, that's who you really are. After they hung up, Pete sat with that conversation for a long time. Was Tommy right? Was the real Pete Rose the one who helped his teammates, who played with heart and hustle, who gave everything to the game? Or was the real Pete Rose the one who gambled compulsively, lied repeatedly, and broke the rules? Maybe the truth was that he was both. Maybe everyone is both, capable of great good and terrible mistakes. The question was which version of himself he would choose to be from this point forward. On Thursday, Pete drove to northern Kentucky to visit his mother, Laverne Rose. She was 74 now, living in a modest house in the suburbs. His father, Harry, had died in 1970, just as Pete's career was taking off. Laverne opened the door wearing a flower print dress and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "Peter Edward Rose," she said, using his full name the way she had when he was a boy in trouble. "Get in here." The house smelled like it always had. Coffee, furniture polish, and something baking. Laverne had made apple pie, Pete's favorite. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one Pete had eaten breakfast at before school every morning for 18 years. Laverne cut him a large slice of pie and poured him coffee without asking. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "Thanks, Mum. I'm your mother. I'm supposed to tell you the truth." She sat down across from him, her blue eyes sharp and assessing. "Talk to me, not the newspaper version, the real story." Pete told her everything. The gambling, the lies, the IRS investigation, Carol leaving. He held nothing back. If he couldn't be honest with his own mother, what hope did he have? Laverne listened without interrupting. When Pete finished, she was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "Your father would be disappointed," she said finally. The words hit Pete harder than any newspaper headline or angry fan letter. "I know, but he would also tell you that a man's character isn't determined by his mistakes. It's determined by what he does after he makes them." Laverne reached across the table and took Pete's hand. "You've done wrong, Peter, no question about that. But you're still my son, and you're still a good man underneath all this mess. The question is, what are you going to do now?" "I don't know, Mom. I honestly don't know." "Then figure it out. You're Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle. You never gave up on the field. Don't give up on yourself now." Pete stayed for dinner. Laverne made pot roast with carrots and potatoes, another of his childhood favorites. They talked about family, about Pete's siblings, about happier times. When Pete left, Laverne hugged him tight at the door. "Come back soon," she said. "And Peter, remember what your father used to say, it's not how hard you hit, it's how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." Pete drove back to Cincinnati as darkness fell. The city lights twinkled across the river, beautiful and indifferent. Life went on, whether Pete Rose figured out his own or not. Saturday arrived again, and Pete found himself returning to Findlay Market. It was becoming a routine, this weekly pilgrimage. He arrived around 10 o'clock, bought coffee, and found the bench where he'd first met James Washington. James arrived shortly after, right on schedule, with his shopping bag and friendly smile. "You came back," James said, sitting down. "I did. How was your week?" Pete told him about the meetings with lawyers, the letter to Carol, the conversation with his mother. James listened attentively, nodding occasionally, asking questions that showed he was really hearing what Pete was saying. "Sounds like you're starting to do the work," James said. "What work?" "The work of rebuilding. It's like when a building burns down. You can't just paint over the ashes and call it fixed. You have to clear everything away, go down to the foundation and start building again. That's hard work, it's slow work, but it's the only way to do it right." "I don't know if I have the strength for that," Pete admitted. "Sure you do. You had the strength to play baseball for 24 years at the highest level. You had the strength to break Ty Cobb's record. You think that was all physical?" James shook his head. "That took mental toughness, discipline, persistence. You have those qualities, Pete. You just need to redirect them." A young couple walked past, pushing a stroller with a sleeping baby. The woman was laughing at something the man said. They looked happy, uncomplicated. Pete felt a pang of envy. "Can I tell you something?" James said. "After I got sober, after I started putting my life back together, I had this moment. I was at work at the P&G plant doing my job, and suddenly I realized I was okay. Not happy, not fixed, but okay. I could function. I could get through a day without falling apart, and that was huge. How long did it take to get to okay? About 3 years. James saw Pete's face fall. I know that sounds like forever. But here's the thing, those 3 years were going to pass, whether I did the work or not. I could spend them wallowing in my misery, or I could spend them rebuilding. At least if I rebuilt, I'd have something to show for it at the end. Pete thought about that. 3 years. By 1992, he'd be 51. Old for a baseball player, but still plenty of life left to live. The question was, what kind of life it would be. I got a call from a sports memorabilia company, Pete said. They want me to do autograph signings, $50 per signature, 4-hour sessions at card shows. That's good, James said. Is it? It feels like I'm selling my past, like a trained seal performing for fish. Or, James countered, you're connecting with fans who still care about you and what you accomplished. You're providing something people want, and you're earning an honest living. There's no shame in that. Pete hadn't thought of it that way. I guess not. You know what else you could do? James stood, preparing to do his grocery shopping. You could volunteer, youth baseball programs, community centers, places where kids need mentors. You've got knowledge and experience that could help young people. That might not pay the bills, but it might pay something more important. After James left, Pete walked through the market, thinking about what he'd said. Volunteering, mentoring, giving back. He thought about that rookie Tommy Helms had mentioned, the one Pete had helped during a rain delay. He couldn't even remember the kid's name, but apparently it had mattered to him, had helped him feel like he belonged. Pete stopped at a payphone and looked up the number for the Cincinnati Recreation Commission. A woman answered, and Pete asked about youth baseball programs. We're always looking for volunteer coaches, the woman said enthusiastically, especially for the fall league. Do you have coaching experience? Some, Pete said, almost laughing at the understatement. My name is Pete Rose. There was a pause. The Pete Rose? Yeah, another pause. Mr. Rose, I'm going to transfer you to our director. Please hold. Pete waited, wondering if this was a mistake. Maybe they wouldn't want him around kids. Maybe his reputation would make him toxic. Mr. Rose, this is Gerald Mitchell, director of the CRC. The voice was cautious. I understand you're interested in volunteering? I am. I know I've got baggage, but I grew up playing in these rec leagues. I know what it meant to me. If I can help some kids learn the game the right way, I'd like to do that. Can I be frank with you? Mitchell said. Please. You've made mistakes. Everyone knows that. But you're also one of the greatest players who ever lived. Kids could learn a lot from you, both about baseball and about life. About how to handle adversity, about taking responsibility for your actions. If you're serious about this, and if you understand that you'd be a role model whether you want to be or not, then yes, we'd welcome your help. I'm serious, Pete said. And I understand. Then let's set up a meeting. We have a team of 10 to 12-year-olds that could use a coach. The season starts in 3 weeks. Pete hung up, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. A small flutter of excitement, of purpose. It wasn't baseball at the major league level. It wasn't the roar of crowds or the bright lights, but it was something. A small step forward. He drove to Carol's mother's house. Her car was in the driveway. Pete sat in his own car for a moment, gathering courage, then walked to the door and knocked. Carol answered. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and an old sweatshirt. But she was still beautiful to Pete. Hi, he said. Hi. Did you get my letter? I did. Carol didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. It meant something, that you took the time to write it all out. I meant every word. Carol, I know I've said sorry before and not backed it up with actions, but I'm trying to change, really change. I met with lawyers, I'm dealing with the IRS. I'm starting to face everything I've been running from. Pete, I want to believe you, but I've been down this road before. I know. I'm not asking you to come back right now. I'm not even asking you to give me another chance. I just wanted you to know that I'm working on myself. Whether we get back together or not, I need to do this. Carol studied his face. You look different. I can't explain it, but something's different. I feel different. I'm not fixed. I'm nowhere close to fixed, but I'm trying. They talked for a few more minutes on the doorstep. Carol didn't say she was coming home, but she didn't say she wasn't either. When Pete left, he felt like maybe there was a tiny glimmer of hope. The following Monday, Pete met with Gerald Mitchell at the Cincinnati Recreation Commission offices. They discussed expectations, background checks, the commitment required. Pete signed up officially as a volunteer coach for the Westwood Warriors, a team of 11 and 12-year-olds in the Fall Recreational League. First practice is Thursday at 4 o'clock, Mitchell said. Westwood Park, Field 3. The kids don't know you're coaching yet. We wanted to wait until it was official. Thursday afternoon, Pete arrived at Westwood Park 30 minutes early. The field was in decent shape, though the grass was patchy and the dugouts could use paint. It reminded him of the fields he'd played on as a kid. Nothing fancy, just a place to play baseball. The kids started arriving, dropped off by parents who did double takes when they saw Pete Rose standing by the dugout. Some approached him cautiously, introducing themselves and their sons or daughters. Others kept their distance, suspicious or disapproving. By 4 o'clock, Pete had 15 kids in front of him, wearing mismatched jerseys and carrying gloves of varying quality. They ranged from tiny 11-year-olds to nearly adult 12-year-olds who were already shaving. They were every race and background. Black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids. This was Cincinnati's future, Pete realized. This is what mattered. All right, gather round, Pete said. The kids formed a semicircle in front of him. My name is Pete Rose, but you can call me Coach Pete. I'm here to teach you baseball, not just how to hit or field, but the right way to play the game, with respect, with effort, with integrity. A small black kid with glasses raised his hand. Coach Pete, did you really get 4,256 hits? I did. That's a lot of hits, the kid said, impressed. It is. But you know what? Every single one of those hits started with practice, with showing up every day and doing the work. That's what we're going to do here. We're going to work hard, we're going to get better, and we're going to do it together as a team. Pete divided them into groups and ran them through basic drills, fielding grounders, catching pop flies, taking batting practice. He watched them carefully, noting each kid's strengths and weaknesses, offering corrections and encouragement. There was a big kid named Marcus. Pete smiled at the name, who had power but swung at everything. A small kid named Tommy who was scared of the ball. A girl named Sarah who had great hands but no confidence. Pete worked with each of them individually, sharing tips from his decades of experience. Marcus, watch the pitcher's hand, Pete demonstrated. Don't start your swing until you see the ball. It's not about swinging hard, it's about swinging smart. Tommy, the ball is not going to hurt you if you catch it right. Here, let me show you. Pete positioned Tommy's glove correctly. See? Now try it. Sarah, you've got skills. Stop apologizing every time you make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. That's how you learn. By the time practice ended 2 hours later, Pete was exhausted but energized. The kids crowded around him, asking questions, showing him their gloves, wanting just one more minute of his attention. As the parents picked up their children, a few approached Pete. One mother, a black woman in scrubs who'd clearly come straight from work, introduced herself as Marcus's mother. Mr. Rose, I just wanted to thank you, she said. Marcus has struggled with confidence. His father passed away 2 years ago, and he hasn't had a male role model to teach him things like sports. This means a lot to him. Pete felt a lump in his throat. He's a good kid, lots of potential. I know you've been through some difficult times, she continued quietly. I just wanted you to know. What you're doing here matters. Whatever happened before, this right here is making a difference. After everyone left, Pete sat alone in the dugout as the sun set behind the outfield fence. He thought about what James Washington had said about honoring his son Marcus's memory by helping other kids. Maybe Pete could do the same thing. Maybe he couldn't undo his mistakes or restore his reputation. Maybe he'd never get into the Hall of Fame or be forgiven by baseball. But he could help these kids. He could teach them to love the game, to play it the right way, to learn lessons that would serve them long after their playing days ended. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. It was a purpose beyond himself, and right now, that was enough. Winter arrived early in Cincinnati that year. By November, snow was already falling, covering the city in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Pete Rose sat in Reuven Katz's office, signing papers that formalized his settlement with the IRS. The final amount was $366,000, less than the original estimate thanks to Katz's negotiations, but still a staggering sum. Pete had worked out a payment plan that would take years to complete. He'd sold his Corvette, some memorabilia, and agreed to a grueling schedule of autograph signings to generate income. It's done, Katz said, gathering the papers. You're going to be paying this off for a long time, Pete. But you avoided criminal charges. That's the important thing. Pete nodded. He should feel relief, but mostly, he just felt tired. The legal battle had consumed months of his life. At least now it was resolved. Outside, snow was falling gently on Fountain Square. Pete walked through the city, no longer hiding under his cap, no longer avoiding eye contact. He'd learned that running from his problems didn't make them disappear, it only made them grow larger. His Saturday meetings with James Washington had become the anchor of his week. They'd grown beyond just Pete talking about his troubles. Now they talked about everything: sports, politics, family, life. James had become more than a sympathetic ear. He'd become a friend. "How's the coaching going?" James asked one Saturday in December as they sat in their usual spot, both bundled in winter coats. "Good. Really good." Pete smiled. "We had our last game before Christmas break. The kids have improved so much. Marcus, you'll appreciate this given your son's name. Marcus hit his first home run. You should have seen his face." "That's wonderful." James's eyes crinkled with genuine joy. "See, that's the kind of thing that matters. That boy will remember that moment for the rest of his life, and you gave that to him." "His mother told me something that's been stuck in my head," Pete said. "She said that her son finally has a male role model again. That made me realize I have a responsibility here. These kids look up to me whether I deserve it or not. I have to be worthy of that." "You're figuring it out, Pete, slowly but surely." Pete had indeed been figuring things out piece by piece. He'd started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings, sitting in church basements with other people who struggled with addiction. It was humbling to share his story with strangers, to admit powerlessness, to accept help. But it was also freeing. In December, Carol came home, not with fanfare or drama, but quietly, almost tentatively. She'd moved her things back into the apartment while Pete was at a memorabilia show. When he came home, she was in the kitchen making dinner. "Hi," she'd said, the same way she'd said it months earlier when he'd shown up at her mother's house. "Hi," Pete had replied. They didn't pretend everything was fixed. Their marriage was still fragile, still rebuilding trust that had been shattered. But they were trying. That was something. Carol had laid down conditions. Pete had to continue therapy, continue GA meetings, be completely transparent about finances. No more gambling, not even a friendly bet on a game. Pete had agreed to all of it without hesitation. "I'm not the same man you married," Pete told her one night as they lay in bed. "I don't mean that as an excuse. I mean, I've changed. Some for the worse, obviously. But I'm trying to change in better ways, too." "I know," Carol said softly. "I see it. That's why I'm here." The baseball memorabilia circuit became Pete's new career. He traveled to card shows across the Midwest: Cleveland, Chicago, Indianapolis, Detroit. He'd sit at tables for hours, signing autographs, taking photos, talking to fans. Some were supportive, thanking him for memories. Others were critical, asking pointed questions about the gambling. Pete answered them all honestly now. No more lies, no more deflection. "Did you really bet on baseball?" a teenage boy asked at a show in Columbus. "I did," Pete said. "And it was wrong. I betrayed the game I loved, and the people who believed in me. I'm not proud of it, but I can't change it either. All I can do is try to be better going forward." The honesty disarmed people. They'd come expecting Charlie Hustle, the brash legend, the unapologetic rebel. Instead, they found a humbled man trying to make amends. Some were disappointed, most were moved. In January 1990, Pete received an unexpected phone call. It was from a producer at a local television station. "Mr. Rose, we're doing a series on sports figures who've overcome adversity. We'd like to interview you, if you're interested." Pete's first instinct was to refuse. He didn't want to be a cautionary tale, an object lesson in how not to live your life. But then he thought about what James Washington had said about helping others by sharing your experience. "What would the interview focus on?" Pete asked. "Your story. The mistakes you made, but also what you're doing now to rebuild your life. We've heard about your coaching, your work with kids. We think it's a story of redemption that could inspire people who are struggling with their own challenges." Pete agreed. The interview aired in February. He sat across from a sympathetic interviewer and talked candidly about his gambling addiction, the lies, the consequences, but he also talked about the people who'd helped him: James Washington, Reuven Katz, his mother, Carol. He talked about coaching kids and finding purpose beyond his own fame. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, some hateful, many supportive. People shared their own stories of addiction and recovery. Parents thanked him for being honest about his struggles. Some of the letters made Pete cry. One came from Pete Jr., his son. They'd been estranged for years, the relationship damaged by the divorce from Pete's first wife, and then by the gambling scandal. The letter was short. "Dad, I watched your interview. I'm proud of you for being honest. I'm proud that you're trying to change. I'd like to talk, if you're willing. Love, Pete. Pete called him that night. They talked for 2 hours, clearing the air, apologizing, reconnecting. It wasn't a magical healing. There was too much hurt for that. But it was a start. Spring arrived, bringing with it a new baseball season, one that Pete Rose would watch from the outside. The Reds' opening day was April 9th. Normally, Pete would have been in the stadium, either playing or coaching. This year, he watched from his apartment, Carol beside him on the couch. "Do you miss it?" Carol asked as they watched the first pitch. "Every day," Pete admitted. "But I'm learning to live with that. Missing something and being consumed by it are different things." The Westwood Warriors started their spring season in late April. Pete's roster had grown, word had spread about his coaching, and more kids wanted to play. He had 23 players now, enough to run real practice drills and simulate game situations. One of the new kids was a small Asian boy named Danny, who'd moved to Cincinnati from California with his family. Danny was shy, barely spoke above a whisper, and flinched every time a ball came near him. "Coach, I don't think I'm good at baseball," Danny said after dropping an easy fly ball. Pete knelt down to Danny's level. "You know what? I wasn't good at baseball when I started either. I was small, I wasn't the fastest, I couldn't hit for power, but I worked at it every single day. And you know what happened? You got 4,256 hits? Exactly. But it took me 24 years and about 14,000 games to do it. You've played, what, 4 games? Give yourself time. Keep working, I'll help you." Pete worked with Danny after every practice, hitting him easy fly balls until Danny could catch them consistently, praising him when he did well, encouraging him when he didn't. Slowly, game by game, Danny's confidence grew. In June, Danny caught a pop fly to end a game. It wasn't a hard catch, but it was his first one in a real game situation. Danny's face lit up with pure joy. His parents, watching from the bleachers, cheered wildly. After the game, Danny's father approached Pete. "Mr. Rose, thank you. Danny has struggled to fit in since we moved here. This team, your coaching, it's given him something to be confident about." "He's a good kid," Pete said. "He reminds me of me at that age, just needs to believe in himself." That night, Pete told James about it during their regular Saturday meeting at Findlay Market. "That's exactly what I was talking about," James said enthusiastically. "You're using your experience to help others. That's how you honor the game, Pete, not by being in the Hall of Fame, but by passing on what you learned to the next generation." "You really think I'm honoring the game?" Pete asked quietly. "After everything I did? I do. Look, you made terrible mistakes, nobody's disputing that, but you're not defined only by your worst moments, any more than you're defined only by your best ones. You're defined by the totality of who you are and what you do with your life, and right now, what you're doing matters." As summer progressed, Pete settled into a new rhythm of life, coaching in the evenings, doing memorabilia shows on weekends, attending GA meetings twice a week, going to therapy, working on his marriage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. In August, on the anniversary of his banishment from baseball, Pete woke up feeling heavy. 1 year ago, Commissioner Bart Giamatti had signed the order that ended Pete's official relationship with the game he loved. The pain was still sharp, but Pete had learned something over this year. Pain could be transformative if you let it. His pain had forced him to confront who he really was, what he really valued, who he wanted to become. Without that pain, he might have continued down the same destructive path forever. He drove to his mother's house that evening. Laverne made dinner, pot roast again, and they talked about the past year. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. "Really? Even after everything?" "Especially after everything. It's easy to be proud when things are going well. The real test of character is how you handle adversity. You're handling it, Peter. Not perfectly, but honestly. That's all anyone can ask." In September, the Westwood Warriors made it to the championship game of their recreational league. They were playing the Northside Giants, a team that had dominated the league all season. Pete's kids were nervous but excited. Before the game, Pete gathered them in the dugout. "Listen up. I want to tell you something important. Baseball is a game of failure. The best hitters in the world fail 7 out of 10 times. Do you know what that means?" The kids shook their heads. "It means that failure is part of the game. You're going to strike out, you're going to drop balls, you're going to make mistakes. That's okay. What matters is how you respond. Do you give up? Or do you keep hustling, keep trying, keep believing in yourself and your teammates?" "Keep hustling," Marcus shouted. "That's right. So here's what I want from you today. Give me everything you've got. Win or lose, I want you to walk off this field knowing you left it all out there. Can you do that?" "Yes, coach." The game was close, back and forth, exactly the kind of youth baseball game that teaches kids about pressure and perseverance. The Warriors were down by 2 runs, going into the bottom of the last inning. Sarah led off with a single. Marcus struck out swinging. Tommy walked. And then Danny, the shy kid from California who'd been afraid of the ball just months ago, stepped up to the plate. "You can do this, Danny," Pete shouted from the coach's box. "Believe in yourself." Danny took 2 strikes, then on the 3rd pitch, he made contact. The ball soared over the second baseman's head, landing in shallow right field. Sarah scored. Tommy rounded 3rd and scored. Danny stood on first base, grinning from ear to ear. The Warriors didn't win the championship. The Giants scored in their half of the inning and won by 1 run. But as Pete's team walked off the field, not one kid was crying. They were laughing, congratulating each other, proud of how hard they'd fought. "You did great," Pete told them, fighting back his own emotions. "Every single one of you. I'm proud to be your coach." Danny's parents approached Pete after the game. "He's going to remember this forever," Danny's mother said. "You gave him confidence he didn't have before. Thank you." Walking to his car, Pete thought about what she'd said. He'd given Danny confidence. He'd helped Marcus find joy. He'd taught Sarah to stop apologizing for being good. He'd shown Tommy that courage means trying even when you're scared. These weren't major league accomplishments. They wouldn't make headlines or earn him a place in Cooperstown, but they were real. They mattered. They were part of his legacy too, just as much as the 4,256 hits. That night, Pete sat with Carol on their small balcony, watching the Cincinnati skyline twinkle in the darkness. "I've been thinking," Carol said, "about what you said months ago, about not being the same man I married. Yeah? I think that's okay. Maybe good even. The man I married had amazing qualities, determination, passion, intensity, but he also had flaws he wouldn't acknowledge. This version of you, the one who admits his mistakes and works to be better, I like him, maybe even more than the old version." Pete took her hand. "I like him better too. Most days anyway. Some days I still miss the old life, the fame, the game. That's human. You spent 24 years having that life. You can't just flip a switch and not miss it. James says that grief and gratitude can exist at the same time. I can grieve what I lost and still be grateful for what I have now. Your friend James is a wise man. He is. He saved my life, Carol, not in a dramatic way, but in a real one. If he hadn't sat down on that bench last August, I don't know where I'd be right now. Probably at the bottom of a bottle or worse." They sat in comfortable silence, the warm September air wrapping around them. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew. Life in Cincinnati continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to individual triumphs and tragedies. "I signed up to coach again next season," Pete said. "Spring and fall leagues both. Good, you're good at it. I'm also thinking about writing a book, not about baseball. There are enough of those already, about the past year, about hitting rock bottom and trying to climb back up. Maybe it could help people who are struggling." Carol squeezed his hand. "I think that's a wonderful idea." The following Saturday, Pete met James Washington at their usual bench at Findlay Market. The autumn weather was perfect, crisp and clear, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive. "I've been doing this for over a year now," Pete said, "meeting you here, talking." "Time flies," James agreed. "I wanted to thank you. Properly, thank you. You probably don't realize it, but you changed my life. That first day, when you sat down next to me, I was in a very dark place. I'd lost everything that mattered to me, or I thought I had. You showed me that there was another way to look at things," James smiled. "I just shared my own experience. You did the hard work yourself. Still, I want you to know it mattered. You mattered." "That's kind of you to say, Pete, but to be honest, you helped me too." "How?" "After Marcus died, after I got sober, I've spent 18 years wondering why that stranger helped me. What was the point? Why did I survive when my son didn't? What was I supposed to do with this second chance?" James looked at Pete directly. "Then I met you, and I realized maybe this was why. Maybe I was supposed to survive so I could sit on this bench and talk to Pete Rose when he needed someone to talk to. Maybe that was the purpose." Pete felt tears prick his eyes. "You think life works like that? That everything happens for a reason?" "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. But I like to think that our pain can have meaning if we use it to help others. Your pain, my pain. Maybe it's not wasted if it makes us more compassionate, more understanding, more willing to extend a hand to someone else who's drowning." They sat together as the morning advanced, watching the market come to life. Vendors setting up their stalls, families beginning their weekend shopping, life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity. "You know what I'm grateful for?" Pete said finally. "I'm grateful that I fell. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. If I'd never been banned, if I'd never hit rock bottom, I'd still be that arrogant guy who thought he was above the rules. I'd still be lying to myself and everyone else. I'd still be destroying my relationships and my life, one bet at a time." That's wisdom, Pete. Real wisdom. I'm grateful for you too, for Carol giving me another chance, for my kids starting to talk to me again, for those kids on the Warriors who look at me like I'm someone worth listening to, for my mother never giving up on me. Pete paused. And I'm grateful that even though I can't play baseball anymore, I can still be part of the game by teaching it to kids who love it the way I did. James stood, preparing for his weekly shopping. "You're going to be okay, Pete Rose. You're going to have bad days, setbacks, moments when you want to give up. But you're going to be okay." After James left, Pete sat alone on the bench for a while longer. He thought about the past year, the longest, hardest year of his life. He'd lost so much, but he'd also gained something invaluable: the truth about himself. He wasn't Pete Rose, the hit king anymore. He wasn't Charlie Hustle, the baseball legend. He was just Pete, flawed, broken in places, but trying to be honest, trying to be better, trying to make amends for the damage he'd caused. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Pete drove to Riverfront Stadium, parking in his old spot from habit. He walked around the outside of the building, running his hand along the concrete walls. Inside, the Reds were playing an afternoon game. He could hear the crowd roar when something exciting happened. Part of him would always ache for that, the roar of the crowd, the crack of the bat, the feel of dirt under his cleats. That was his first love, his true love. Baseball had given him everything: purpose, identity, fame, fortune, and he had betrayed it. But standing outside those walls, Pete realized something important. Baseball might be closed to him now, but life wasn't. There were still games to coach, kids to mentor, relationships to heal, amends to make. There was still his wife, his children, his mother, his friends. There was still the possibility of becoming the man he should have been all along. He walked back to his car as the sun climbed higher in the sky. On the way, he passed a father teaching his son to throw a baseball in a nearby park. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, the same age Pete had been when his own father first put a ball in his hand. "Keep your elbow up," the father was saying. "That's it, good throw." The boy beamed with pride at his father's approval. Pete smiled, remembering that feeling. That pure joy of playing catch, of learning the game, of making your father proud, that's what it was really about, Pete realized. Not the records or the fame or the money. It was about the love of the game, the joy of competition, the satisfaction of mastering a difficult skill, the camaraderie of teammates, the bond between father and son over a simple game of catch. He'd lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but he was finding it again, game by game, kid by kid, day by day. Pete drove home to Carol, to the small apartment that was no longer suffocating, but had become a sanctuary. He'd made plans to have dinner with Pete Jr. next week. He had a memorabilia show in Cleveland next weekend. He had Warriors practice on Tuesday and Thursday. He had his Saturday meeting with James. It was a life, not the life he'd planned, not the life he'd once had, but it was real and honest and his. That evening, Pete sat at the kitchen table with his notebook. He'd been keeping a journal since the summer, writing down his thoughts and feelings, tracking his progress and setbacks. It was something his therapist had suggested, and Pete had found it helpful. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote, "What I've learned." Then he began to list. Falling doesn't define you. Getting back up does. Honesty is harder than lying, but infinitely more valuable. You can't outrun your mistakes. You have to face them. Pride comes before a fall, but humility can lead to redemption. Your legacy isn't just what you accomplish, it's also how you treat people and what you teach others. Everyone is fighting invisible battles. Be kind. It's never too late to change, but you have to want to change. Asking for help isn't weakness, it's courage. You are more than your worst mistake, but you're also responsible for making it right. Sometimes the people who help you most are complete strangers, who see you when you need to be seen. Pete looked at what he'd written. These weren't just platitudes or empty words. They were truths he'd learned the hard way, paid for with years of pain and loss. Carol came home from visiting a friend. She looked over Pete's shoulder at what he was writing. "That's good," she said softly. "That's really good." I was thinking about what you said, about writing a book. Maybe these could be a start. Maybe so. That night, Pete dreamed about baseball for the first time in months, but it wasn't a dream about playing, it was a dream about teaching. He was at a baseball field surrounded by kids of all ages and backgrounds. He was showing them how to grip a bat, how to position their feet, how to keep their eye on the ball. And they were listening, really listening, soaking up his knowledge and experience. In the dream, his father appeared standing behind the backstop watching. Harry Rose nodded at his son, a small smile on his weathered face, a gesture of approval, of pride. Pete woke up feeling lighter than he had in years. 3 years later, 1992. The fall air was crisp and perfect for baseball as Pete Rose stood behind home plate at Westwood Park. He was 51 years old now, his hair grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes clearer than they'd been in decades. The Warriors were having their end-of-season party. Parents had brought food, hot dogs, potato salad, cookies, lemonade. The kids were running around playing, their laughter echoing across the field. Pete had coached for 3 full years now. Some of his original players, like Marcus and Sarah and Danny, had moved on to high school baseball. But new kids came every season, eager to learn from the man who'd gotten more hits than anyone in baseball history. His book, Getting Back Up: Lessons from Rock Bottom, had been published 6 months earlier. It wasn't a bestseller, but it had found its audience, people struggling with addiction, people trying to rebuild their lives after failure, people looking for honest stories about redemption. The reviews were mostly positive. Some critics said he was exploiting his fame. Others said he was doing important work by speaking honestly about his failures. Pete didn't worry too much about critics anymore. He knew who he was now. He knew what he'd done wrong and what he was trying to do right. Carol stood beside him, her hand in his. Their marriage had survived, stronger for having been tested. They'd weathered the storms together, learned to communicate honestly, built a new foundation based on truth rather than image. Pete Jr. was there too, with his girlfriend. Father and son had slowly, painstakingly rebuilt their relationship. It would never be what it might have been if Pete hadn't made so many mistakes, but it was real and growing. James Washington arrived, carrying his usual shopping bag, even though he'd come from the party, not the market. He and Pete had maintained their Saturday meetings, though now they sometimes met at other places, restaurants, ball games, each other's homes. James had become part of Pete's family. "Another season in the books," James said, clapping Pete on the shoulder. "Yeah. Good kids this year. They're all good kids. They just need someone to believe in them and teach them the right way." Danny's parents approached. Danny was in high school now, playing on the freshman team and thriving. "We wanted to thank you again, Mr. Rose," Danny's father said. "Our son found himself because of what you taught him here. He's confident now, making friends, doing well in school. You changed his life." "He did the work," Pete said. "I just showed him how. Still, we're grateful." As the party continued, Pete found a quiet moment to sit in the dugout, the same dugout where he'd coached hundreds of practices and games. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. He'd never gotten back into baseball officially. The ban remained in place. He wasn't in the Hall of Fame. His records were there, but his plaque wasn't. That still hurt sometimes, late at night when he let himself think about it. But he'd found something else. Purpose beyond personal glory, meaning beyond individual achievement. He'd discovered that the real legacy wasn't the records or the fame. It was the impact you had on individual lives. Marcus from his team had gotten a baseball scholarship to the University of Cincinnati. Sarah was one of the top players in the city's high school softball league. Danny had overcome his shyness and fear. Dozens of other kids had learned to love baseball, to work hard, to believe in themselves. That mattered. Maybe it mattered more than anything else Pete had ever done. "What are you thinking about?" Carol asked, sitting beside him in the dugout. "About how different my life is from what I thought it would be. Better or worse?" Pete considered the question seriously. "Different. Not what I wanted, but maybe what I needed. I'm not famous anymore. I'm not rich. I'm not in the Hall of Fame, but I'm at peace with myself in a way I never was before. I'm not lying to anyone, especially myself. I have real relationships instead of superficial ones based on my celebrity. I'm doing work that matters to people who need what I can teach them." "That sounds better to me," Carol said. "Yeah," Pete agreed. "Yeah, I think it is." As the sun began to set behind the outfield fence, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Pete stood and walked onto the field. He picked up a baseball, scuffed and grass-stained from the season's games, and felt its familiar weight in his hand. He thought about a scared kid in 1989, sitting on a bench at Findlay Market, convinced his life was over. He thought about James Washington, a grieving father who'd turned his pain into purpose. He thought about all the people who'd helped him climb out of the pit he'd dug for himself. His mother, his wife, his lawyer, his therapist, the people at Gamblers Anonymous, the parents who trusted him with their children despite his past. And he thought about the kids. All the kids he'd coached over 3 years. The shy ones who found confidence, the troubled ones who found discipline, the talented ones who learned humility, the struggling ones who learned perseverance. That was his legacy now. Not 4,156 hits, not 3 batting titles or 17 All-Star selections or a World Series MVP award. His legacy was teaching Danny to catch a fly ball, showing Marcus how to read a pitcher, helping Sarah believe in herself, coaching 23 kids every season to play baseball the right way, with heart, with effort, with integrity. "Coach Pete," a group of kids called to him from the picnic area. "Come get some food before it's all gone." Pete smiled and jogged over, slowly, his 51-year-old knees reminding him he wasn't 25 anymore. But he jogged because Charlie Hustle never walked when he could run. That night, Pete stood on his balcony one more time, looking out at the Cincinnati skyline. The city that had celebrated him, then rejected him, then slowly accepted him again, but in a different way, on different terms. He thought about the path that had led him here, the glory days, the fall from grace, the dark night of the soul, the slow, painful climb back toward the light, the small victories, the daily choice to be better than he'd been yesterday. It wasn't the story he'd wanted to tell, but it was his story, true and hard-won. And maybe, just maybe, it was a story worth telling, not because he was Pete Rose, the baseball legend, but because he was Pete Rose, the flawed human being who'd made terrible mistakes and was trying to make amends. He thought about something James Washington had said years ago: "Your pain isn't wasted if it helps someone else." Pete's pain had been immense. But if his story could help one person struggling with addiction, one person who'd hit rock bottom, one person who thought they were beyond redemption, then maybe it wasn't wasted. Maybe it had purpose after all. The city lights twinkled below, each one representing a life, a story, a struggle. Somewhere out there, someone was sitting on a bench feeling like their world had ended. Somewhere out there, someone was carrying a stone of guilt so heavy they could barely move. Somewhere out there, someone was losing hope. Pete couldn't reach all of them, but he could reach the ones in front of him. The kids at practice, the people who read his book, the stranger he might sit next to at Findlay Market someday. He could throw them a rope the way James had thrown him one. He could share his story, not to excuse his mistakes, but to show that mistakes don't have to be the end. That falling doesn't define you, that you can get back up. Inside the apartment, Carol was making tea. Pete went to join her, closing the balcony door on the cool night air. He had practice with the Warriors on Tuesday, a memorabilia show in Indianapolis on Saturday, a meeting with his publisher about a possible second book, dinner with Pete Jr. on Sunday. He had a life. Not the life he'd imagined standing on the field at Riverfront Stadium in 1985, holding that ball for his 4,192nd hit, basking in the adoration of millions, but a real life. An honest life. A life with purpose and meaning and second chances, and that, Pete Rose had learned, was enough. Epilogue. On a Saturday morning in 1995, an older man sat alone on a bench at Findlay Market, his head in his hands, shoulders slumped with the weight of the world. He'd lost his business, his wife had left him, his adult children weren't speaking to him, he'd made mistakes, so many mistakes, and now he was paying for them all at once. A figure approached and sat down beside him. The man looked up to see Pete Rose, now 54, hair grey but eyes warm with understanding. "You okay?" Pete asked simply. The man shook his head. "No, not really. You want to talk about it?" And so the man talked. Pete listened. When the man finished, Pete said, "I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it feels like to think you're beyond saving. But I'm going to tell you what someone once told me. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. And no matter how far you've fallen, there's always a ladder to climb, but you have to want to grab it." The man looked at Pete with something like hope flickering in his eyes. "You think so?" "I know so. Because I've been where you are, and I found my way back. Not to where I was. You can't go back, but to somewhere new. Somewhere better in some ways." They talked for an hour. When they parted, Pete gave the man his phone number. "Call me if you need to talk. Anytime." As Pete walked away, he thought about James Washington, who had passed away the previous year at age 66. Pete had been at his funeral, had spoken about how James had saved his life simply by sitting down and talking to a stranger in pain. Now Pete was doing the same thing, passing forward the gift that had been given to him, throwing a rope to someone who was drowning. It was a small gesture, just two men talking on a bench at a market. But sometimes, small gestures change lives. Sometimes a simple conversation at exactly the right moment can redirect someone's entire path. Pete didn't know if the man would call him, didn't know if their conversation would make a difference. But he'd done what he could. He'd extended a hand. The rest was up to the man himself. That's what Pete had learned in 6 years of rebuilding his life. You can't save everyone. You can't fix every problem. You can't undo your mistakes or erase your regrets. But you can show up. You can be honest. You can extend compassion to others because you know what it's like to need it yourself. You can turn your mess into your message, your pain into purpose, your failure into wisdom. You can get back up. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that's enough to change not just your own life, but the lives of others who cross your path. Pete Rose walked through Findlay Market, no longer hiding his face, no longer ashamed to be seen. He was just Pete now, not the hit king, not Charlie Hustle. Just Pete, a man who'd fallen hard and climbed back up, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one person at a time. And somewhere, watching from wherever he was, Pete hoped that James Washington was smiling, that Harry Rose was nodding his approval, that all the people who'd helped him along the way knew that their efforts hadn't been wasted. He'd made mistakes, terrible, costly mistakes that he would regret for the rest of his life, but he hadn't let those mistakes be the end of his story. He'd gotten back up, and that in the end was what mattered most.